We are in the Quebec capital again tonight, where, as you can probably tell, it's suddenly gotten very windy. While the G7 leaders are meeting 150 kilometers away in the remote Lamal Bay resort area, there has been a flurry of activity here throughout the day, from government officials, media from around the world, and occasionally confrontation between police and protesters. They wanted this to be a day of disruption, but the hundreds of anti-G7 demonstrators who turned out today were outnumbered by police. We'll have more on that in a moment, but first to the summit itself. And on day one of the meeting, all eyes were on Donald Trump. Already the odd man out in the group, he went and picked a new fight even before he arrived. But by this evening, Trump sure seemed to be making nice. Our coverage begins with the CBC's David Cochran.
Obviously, trade has been a topic of discussion and will continue to be. But
after a week of tweets, tariffs, and turmoil, finally some laughs.
Justin has agreed to cut all tariffs and all trade barriers between Canada and the United States. So I'm very happy about that.
I'd say NAFTA's in good shape.
But we are actually working on it.
A light moment on a heavy topic.
Our relationship is very good. We are actually working on cutting tariffs and making it all very fair for both countries.
Nice words, but the tariffs are still there and NAFTA is still in limbo. And while the G7 can happily pose for a family photo, this is still a family with problems. Even before he made his way to La Malbaie, the black sheep of that family jolted the G7 once more.
They threw Russia out. They should let Russia come back in, because we should have Russia at the negotiating table.
He's already started a trade war. He now wants the group to reopen its arms to Russia, which was kicked out of the former G8 4 years ago for annexing Crimea, and is the prime suspect in multiple attempts to hack Western elections.
But let's leave 7 as it is. It's a lucky number.
The idea of adding Russia flopped with the leaders of the EU. It was flatly rejected by Canada.
Russia, however, made clear that it had no interest in behaving according to the rules of Western democracies.
The unpredictability highlights the challenges the G7 leaders face in dealing with the U.S. president, who can be tougher on his allies than his enemies. In today's meeting, which sources say were cordial, the other leaders tried to convince the president to drop his tariffs and stop a trade war. So a smiling and joking Trump emerged, the angry tweeter nowhere to be seen. There was even a hint of compromise.
Will you come to an agreement on a joint statement?
We'll see you guys.
I think we'll have a joint statement.
And earlier this evening, I spoke to David, who is at the summit site. David, what do we know about what happened in the private meeting between Trudeau and Trump after the cameras left?
Well, Ian, officials are saying it was a positive and constructive meeting, and the two leaders have agreed that they would accelerate the NAFTA talks, but we are being cautioned by Canadian officials to take that with a grain of salt. We have heard this before. It hasn't always gone that way, but there is at least a sense after a tough week of goodwill between the two countries while the leaders are meeting here face to face. The question is if that goodwill remains after Donald Trump leaves Quebec and gets back on Twitter.
And there was doubt about a final joint communique. What are we hearing about that now?
Yeah, the president suggested that maybe there could be a joint statement, but the president says a lot of things that don't often come true. There is deep doubt here amongst Canadian officials that that could happen because there are still deep divisions on two key issues, trade and climate. The U.S. delegation is insisting that the final document has no reference whatsoever to tariffs and trade. The other 6 nations are balking at that. It's a non-starter for them, and that could be what causes them to not have a united statement when this G7 meeting ends.
Now, for some, hosting the G7 summit here might conjure up images of past chaos, like those violent protests at the Summit of the Americas in 2001. Well, so far, history has not repeated itself. Not that there haven't been skirmishes between police and protesters, there have been. But other images we've seen today paint a relative calm, rather Canadian portrait. A riot officer chatting with a woman on a bench, protesters demonstrating in front of Tim Hortons. And our Jayla Bernstein was on the streets today where the protesters made their voices heard, or at least they tried to. Here's how she saw the day unfold.
They promised a day of disruption. But while protesters did what they could to send their message, they were hampered, often outnumbered, by an intimidating wall of police. A game of cat and mouse played out through the day. Pop-up demos appeared. Police declared them illegal.
This demonstration has been declared unlawful.
Protesters dispersed, and then it happened all over again at another flashpoint. Lulls in the action, followed by standoffs. In one residential alleyway, police swept through with a canine unit, cornering protesters at a dead end. At least 3 were taken into custody. But what stood out the most was the contrast. This heavy police presence tracking every move of a small group of protesters. Not what freedom of expression should look like, says this woman.
Amnesty, vous êtes ici, hein? On n'a pas le droit de manifester.
You're here, aren't you, Amnesty International, she says. Amnesty is here, and it doesn't like what it's seen.
One of the principles that we believe the authorities should be following is to have a presence that corresponds to the risk. And so we believe that this is not what we've seen today.
She's concerned that heavy-handed security is simply shutting people down.
Some of them feared coming in the streets even before the G7. What we have denounced, of course, is kind of a climate of fear that happened before the G7, not only from, of course, articles that we found in the media, but also statements on severe security measures.
They say the job of police is not just to protect the public, but also the rights of those protesting. And with more demonstrations planned for tomorrow, Amnesty says it'll be watching. Jayla Bernstein, CBC News, Quebec City.
Later on the National, more from the G7. For many of those protesters, world leaders won't even see or hear their message. So what motivates them to demonstrate?
And he was a chef, a TV host, and a talented storyteller who connected legions of fans with world culture through food. We look at the legacy of Anthony Bourdain.
But first, Ontario voted for change, and they sure got it in Doug Ford. So what comes next? A good, hard look at the books, as it turns out. Here's Hannah Thibodeau.
He didn't take much time to celebrate his big win.
Gotta apologize, my voice is a little hoarse this morning.
Just over 12 hours after winning a resounding majority, Premier-designate Doug Ford got right down to business. He and his team started the transition to take over from the defeated Liberals.
After a hard-fought campaign, we know the hard work has just begun, but we intend to act fast.
The Tory leader didn't say just how quickly he'll move on big campaign pledges, like cutting gas taxes by 10 cents a litre, scrapping the current sex education curriculum, and lowering taxes for the middle class and corporations. Ford says the transition will take about 21 days, and in that time, he and his team will start looking at Ontario's books and figure out who will be in his cabinet. Once he is sworn in, that's when Ford goes from designate to premier. But right now, his team says it's about coming to grips with the province's financial situation.
I think it's getting the fiscal house in order. It's making sure that Doug and his transition team get in there and they see the state of the books and get right to work.
And the spin already, it's not going to be good.
And I predict we're going to find out the state of the Ontario finances is pretty bad.
Even if the finances are worse than expected, some say Ford will fulfill all of his promises.
I think Doug Ford's the type of leader who will pound the desk when people give him excuses about why things are too complicated or why they can't be done. And Doug Ford's going to say, you're going to lose your job if you don't figure out a way to help me keep my promises.
Throughout the more than 4-week campaign, Ford never provided his party's accounting of its campaign promises, leaving some a bit skeptical of this polarizing political leader.
People out there have given me a clear mandate, a very clear mandate to govern. We're going to govern. We have a team ready.
Ford may have the team ready, but now he'll have to move from campaign rhetoric to governing. Hannah Thibodeau, CBC News, Toronto.
With the Progressive Conservatives ending 15 years of Liberal rule in Ontario, Doug Ford could now find himself, possibly, on a collision course with the federal Liberals. Tonight, Catherine Cullen looks at what that could mean for Justin Trudeau's political goals.
Justin Trudeau is dealing with one challenging partner right now in the Charlevoix, but when he gets back home, there's a new neighbor to contend with.
I've also spoken with Prime Minister Trudeau.
Today, Doug Ford sounded like an ally.
I said we'll stand united against our neighbors to the south, and I'm very sincere when I say that.
But while Trudeau seemed to sincerely get along with Kathleen Wynne, there is clearly plenty of acrimony between some federal Liberals and Doug Ford.
He is incapable of governing.
Why people would embrace such a manifestly obvious, unqualified candidate for premier.
And some of Ford's goals could derail Trudeau's agenda.
We're going to scrap the carbon tax.
We know that putting a price on carbon pollution drives improvements.
Trudeau's plan to fight climate change involves every province putting a price on carbon. And if they don't, the Prime Minister says he'll impose it.
Which puts them on a kind of a collision course.
I think they're going to be in for a fight. They're going to be in for a fight, certainly in Ontario.
Great pleasure.
Trudeau's environment minister, though, is vaguely optimistic.
People say things during the election. I guess we will see what the plan is.
Then there's health care.
Well, I don't believe in safe injection areas.
But the federal government is the one who approves supervised injection sites, and Trudeau's Liberals believe they save lives. And the big news from the last federal budget that the Liberals are eyeing national pharmacare as a pledge in the next election. If Trudeau's plan requires buy-in, especially money from the provinces, it's not clear Ford would be interested in that either.
In some ways, Ford may have benefited from having Trudeau's carbon tax to campaign against. In 2019, though, the roles will be reversed. So will Ford be a useful foil for Trudeau to campaign against, or just the guy who foils his plans? Catherine Cullen, CBC News, Ottawa.
Okay, so that change from red to blue is sure to put federal-provincial relations to the test, and Trudeau could have some more problems to contend with, too.
The fact that a 15-year-old government in Ontario was kicked out so dramatically, down to 7 seats, does that bode poorly for you?
I don't see any valid comparison.
Quebec's Liberal Party is going into an election this fall, and Premier Philippe Couillard is trailing in popular support. But the province will also be key to the federal Liberals' 2019 re-election strategy. Alberta's NDP premier will fight for re-election next spring. Trudeau and Rachel Notley are close allies on the pipeline file right now, but
stand up to the Trudeau Liberals and defend Alberta.
Rival Jason Kenney has already promised a more antagonistic approach to Trudeau.